Good morning. It is Thursday, October the 3rd, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. I am Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, because I'm the only one who makes the presumption for the status quo. My podcast is about being a true conservative and using true conservatism to beat the left each and every day. Broadcasting is my calling. I podcast because I have something to say. My podcast is made possible by Spreaker.com. It can be heard on iTunes, Spotify, Google, and YouTube. My email address is storytimes@hotmail.com. I'm on Twitter @RonaldHardgrove and on Facebook at The Drill. I started my socio-political odyssey as a conservative Republican and then became a card-carrying member of the Libertarian Party. I'm now a registered independent and true conservative. I was taught by the left how to dress, how to act, what to take seriously, and who to associate with. When I decided to vote Republican, I thought that I could act like a liberal but vote conservative and still consider myself a conservative. I was wrong. Whenever I engaged in liberal debate, I couldn't win. I couldn't win because I couldn't be taken seriously and because I didn't understand the debate dynamic between left and right. I talked conservative, but I acted left. I used lefty lingo, I dressed like the left, and I engaged in petty vice and associated with people who engaged in vice. People who used drugs, gambled, consorted with prostitutes, stole, and cheated. I failed to recognize that the debate dynamic was between psychology, things that are imaginary, and philosophy, things that are real. It was no wonder that the people around me didn't take me seriously. So I realized that defeating the liberals and socialists starts with getting my act together, by not only voting conservative, but by talking, dressing, and acting conservative, by refusing to associate with common criminals and ne'er-do-wells, by being aware of and resisting left-wing counterculture and using my intellect to defeat psychological bullying and intimidation. By becoming a true conservative, I will not only win, I will never lose. The purpose of my broadcast is to share with my audience the lessons I have learned on how to defeat the left each and every day. Today, I will read the introduction from a book titled Impeachment, a Handbook, New Edition, by Charles L. Black, Jr., and I will pick up where I left off reading Chapter 4 of A False Kind of Christianity by Dan Jensen, covering subjectivity and objectivity. All that when I come back. Thank you. Welcome back. Since there is so much talk on the left and right about impeaching President Trump, I thought it would be good to present a historical perspective on impeachment. The introduction that I'm about to read is from a book written in 1974 during the Nixon administration. It was written for citizens to inform them about impeachment and the impeachment process. Introduction. For the first time in more than a century, and for the second time in our history, the country has, in 1974, been faced with the live possibility that a president may, in the words of the Constitution, quote, be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, unquote. The presidency is a prime symbol of our national unity. The election of the president, with his alternate, the vice president, is the only political act that we've performed together as a nation. Voting in the presidential election is certainly the political choice most significant to the American people and most closely attended to by them. No matter, then, can be of higher political importance than our considering whether in any given instance this act of choice is to be undone, and the chosen president dismissed from office in disgrace. Everyone must shrink from this most drastic of measures. Yet the framers of our Constitution very clearly envisaged the occasional necessity of this awful step and laid down a procedure and standards for its being taken. Their actions on this matter were, as the records of their debates show, very carefully considered. As is true, however, of most other parts of their Constitution, they put in place only a very general framework, leaving it to the future to fill in details and leaving many questions open to honest difference of opinion. This book is about the procedure and standards set up by the Constitution and about some of the questions that must still be answered. While all civil officers of the United States, including federal judges, may be impeached, this book centers on presidential impeachment. When one is writing as an academic constitutional lawyer, for laymen, on debatable questions of law, one ought perhaps to confess one's biases, so that allowances may be made for these. I should say first that, both in voting and in published writing, I have from my youth quite consistently opposed the president who has been the subject of recent proceedings, except for my having taken the public position at an early age in the deplorable train of events leading to those proceedings that he, or any president, ought to be held to enjoy an ample privilege of confidentiality as to communications with his own staff in the White House, and that, to put it concretely, he was under no obligation to give up the celebrated tapes, a position that enjoyed little support from others. To countervail, as I hope, my lifelong political set against just about all of this president's positions, I confess to a very strong sense of the dreadfulness of the step of removal, of the deep wounding such a step must inflict on the country, and thus approach it as one would approach high-risk major surgery, to be resorted to only when the rightness of diagnoses and treatment is sure. The framers of the Constitution have left us, as they must, a legacy not only of certainties but of questions. Where the answer to one of these questions seems to me clear, I shall state and endeavor to support my own position, sometimes trying to state also the arguments for the contrary view. Whereas must often be true, I look on a question as more or less open, I shall so treat it, trying to give arguments on both sides. An understanding of the questions is more important than a fixed conviction concerning the answers. This book is for the citizen. What part ought the citizen to play in the process of impeachment and removal? My own answer would be that, for the most part, our attitude as to any impeachment ought to be that of a vigilant waiting. The impeachment process, whether judicial, non-judicial, criminal, or non-criminal, resembles the judicial criminal procedure in that it is confided by the Constitution to responsible tribunals, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and in that these bodies are duty-bound to act on their own views of the law and the facts, as free as may be of partisan political motives and pressures. In this process, a snow of telegrams ought to play no part. At the same time, we cannot, and perhaps ought not, try to keep ourselves free of opinions concerning the process. Such views inevitably form themselves as one tries to follow and understand what is going on. In their formation, we ought to try to take the same stance of principled political neutrality that we hope to see taken by the White House and the Senate as they go about their work. This is not easy, particularly as to questions that have no certain answers. It is always tempting to resolve such questions in favor of the immediate political result that is palatable to us, for one never can definitely be proved wrong, and so one is free to allow one's prejudices to assume the guise of reason. The best way to combat this tendency is to ask ourselves whether we would have answered the same question the same way if it came up with respect to a president toward whom we felt oppositely from the way we feel toward the president threatened with removal. One further point. It is the cardinal principle, at least of American constitutional interpretation, that the Constitution is to be interpreted so as to be workable and reasonable. This principle does not collide with respect for the intent of, quote, intent of the framers, unquote, because their transcendent intent was to build just such a Constitution. American constitutional law, as expounded by judges and others, is full of instances of the application of this principle. Applying it to doubtful questions regarding impeachment, in this book for the laity, I shall give chief emphasis to arguments of a practical cast. Such arguments do not have the fine savor of ancient learning, but they are the ones that usually do prevail in our constitutional law, particularly when it is at its admired best. And they have the advantage that laymen can understand them, in itself not an inconsiderable merit when one is dealing with a constitution meant for all. For those who wish to pursue any aspect of the subject further, the bibliography opens every road. The constitutional provisions relevant to impeachment and referred to in the text are gathered in an appendix. And that was chapter 1 is called Introduction, and chapter 2 is called The Procedures, which I will read next time. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading from Dan Jensen's book, A False Kind of Christianity, covering subjectivity and objectivity. Thank you very much. And I now continue with Chapter 4 of A False Kind of Christianity, a conservative evangelical refutation of progressive Christianity. And now when I'd left off yesterday, I had covered simplicity and clarity. And let's see, here we go. And I will now read the section titled Subjectivity and Objectivity. And so this section is important because this is basically determines whether or not you are right or left. If you're subjective, you're a lefty. And if you're objective, you're a conservative. Subjectivity and objectivity. We now come to one of the most important and pernicious methods used to deny the first principles of knowledge and the conclusions that flow from them. This method attempts to deny the reality of objectivity and opts instead for subjectivity only, which, if true, completely undercuts the first principles of knowledge. The term objective means, quote, independent of the knower, end quote. It does not mean something that everyone knows to be true, but it does mean that everyone could come to see that. Something is true if but it does mean that everyone could come to see that something is true if in fact it is true, and everyone was given access to the evidence. The term subjective means dependent on the knower. This means that the truth is only known by an individual and can only ever be known by the individual. And I want to interject here is the good analogy for this is the tree in the forest analogy. If a tree in a forest falls and no one was around to hear it, did it make a sound? Objectively speaking, yes, it did. Subjectively speaking, no, it didn't. And this has implications because if you're subjective and you say that the truth is only known by an individual and can only ever be known by the individual, you're saying that every man is an island and that no person can know another person or, for that matter, the situation or their surroundings. Back to the book. Allow me to elaborate. I love the band Weezer, as has been stated. That is a truth. I am not lying, but it is a truth that only I can know. I could be lying, and there's no way for anyone to know with absolute certainty whether or not I am. Hence, the fact that I love the band Weezer is a subjective truth. However, if I put my keys in a drawer and do not tell anyone, the fact that they are in the drawer is an objective truth, even though I am the only one who knows about it. The fact that my keys are in the drawer is an objective truth because that fact is independent of me and can be ascertained by others even if currently no one else has received this knowledge. A lot of confusion exists over this issue, even amongst otherwise very well-read people who should know better. A lot of people mistakenly believe that subjective truth is simply a matter of opinion, and a great deal of what one reads today would seem to confirm this, unfortunately. Therefore, when I say that Weezer is a great band, many would say, this is just my opinion. Well, yes and no. It depends on how you are using the term opinion. If, when I make this statement, I intend to say that it is an objective truth that Weezer is a great band and everyone should think so, then clearly that is a false statement. There are, of course, objective standards for music, and that topic would fall under the philosophical topic of aesthetics, something I'm not dwelling extensively on in this work. However, with that made clear, music is also largely a matter of taste. Therefore, when a child bangs her toys together to make a song, that, technically speaking, is not music. Weezer is music, but the extent to which it is pleasing or not is largely a matter of taste. Hence, if by opinion you mean to say that Weezer is a band that I find very fun listening, Fine, but the statement is still somewhat imprecise. Even though we tend to talk about our opinions in this manner, it is technically somewhat confusing. This is because the term opinion is still usually defined as having an element of uncertainty. But I'm not uncertain about the fact that I love Weezer. It is a fact, and the truth that I love, it is a fact and truth that I love Weezer. It may be a subjective truth, but it is a truth nevertheless. In that sense, it really is not my opinion that I love Weezer, and I would not, when using technical language, say that Weezer is a great band, because that would carry too much philosophical baggage with it. Now, I have no problem talking about opinions in the more casual manner. I'm not a legalist, and language is a fluctuating thing. When talking to someone who is trying to get to know me, I could easily see myself asserting that Weezer is a great band, and the person would know exactly what I mean. Technically, though, the term opinion, when speaking precisely, as we are seeking to do here, should be reserved for statements where we assert something that we are not sure about. Therefore, when I say that I am of the opinion that Abraham Lincoln was our greatest president, I am saying that from my reading of the subject, I tentatively believe this to be the case. But I recognize that such a conclusion is not a fact, objectively or subjectively. This is my opinion, and I recognize that it could be wrong, and so I must be humble and open-minded about revising my assessment of the question as to who should be considered America's greatest executive leader. We have to be careful here, though, as this does not fully address one very tricky issue, and so please bear with me. This has to do with the fact that we are still obligated to believe something to be the best option when the evidence strongly favors that option over all others, even if the evidence is not quite strong enough to establish that option as absolute fact. Allow me to give an example to explain what I mean. Almost all historians agree that had JFK not been assassinated, he probably would have gone on to win a second term. This is not something we can establish as an absolute fact, because so many variables are involved. However, just because we cannot establish this beyond doubt does not give us license to believe whatever we want about the topic. It is wrong to say anything other than JFK would have more than likely gone on to win his second term had he lived, based on the evidence. It is not a fact that JFK would have won had he lived, but it is a fact based on the evidence that he more than likely would have gone on to win his second term had he lived. Things are much different from the first presidential example I gave. Abraham Lincoln is not the hands-down winner when it comes to the question of the greatest American president of all time. There's not enough evidence to say with confidence that Abraham Lincoln was even probably the best president of all time. There are too many other contenders, most notably Washington, to make that statement. Hence, saying that I believe Abraham Lincoln was our greatest president is a statement of opinion. And here, I am using the term opinion in a more technical sense. All of this is extremely important to our understanding of objectivity, subjectivity, and opinion. Many throughout history and scores of people today try to deny objective truth. They say that truth is not objective, or they, at the very least, cloud this fact through a haze of complicated, incoherent rhetoric. This stance is known as subjectivism, the notion that all truth is subjective in nature. If they go so far as to say that truth is an illusion, that all we have is our opinions, this is extreme relativism. The problem is that these very same people make very bold assertions about truth all the time, and do so in a way that tacitly assumes that a great deal of truth is objective. It is an inevitable part of our humanity. Spend enough time with anyone, even the most strident skeptic, and they will talk about ethics, politics, academics, etc., in ways that clearly presuppose objective truth. And when they do so, they refute their own subjectivism or extreme relativism. If subjectivism is true, then we all need to stop arguing and go home. Because while I can know a great deal of truth, I can never fully convince anyone else of this truth. And others could know a great deal of truth, but they also could not fully convince anyone else of this truth. And if extreme relativism is true, we need to stop arguing and go home, because we can all believe whatever we want. Many may exuberantly respond to this with a hearty amen. Many PC followers, progressive Christianity followers, may respond with a polite exactly. But if that is true, then why should I listen to you when you argue for your positions in regard to religion, scripture, gender, war, etc. If you respond that you are not really arguing but simply stating your opinion, I have to loudly cry foul. The reason is that I have interacted with subjectivists and diehard relativists for years now, and they constantly argue for their positions in the most tenacious manner possible. It is simply disingenuous in the extreme to assert that you are only articulating your mere opinion or a truth that is only available to you. No, it is clear that all people believe some things to be objectively true, and, therefore, objectivity is proven correct, and subjectivism and extreme relativism fall flat. Many try to get around the force of this argument by pointing to the fact that we know many things by instinct and or emotion, and not simply through rational thought. Many argue that focusing too much on objective truth leads to legalism, rigidity, and staleness. We, they say, cannot forget about emotions, instinct, intuition, experience, art, narrative, etc. And many will say that this is especially the case with religious truth, which is far more like a journey or even a labyrinth. And the overemphasis on objectivity is said to strongly detract from this perspective, if not repudiate it altogether. It is in fact true that gross imbalance on this front occurred during the modern age and even crept into the church to a large degree during this time. Both medieval and Protestant scholasticism struggled with this as well, but the fact of the matter is that this does not need to be an either-or dilemma. We can love art, emotions, narrative, intuition, experience, etc., and still be committed to objectivity. And I've already made clear that we know many things instinctively, and so I hardly disregard the importance of instinct. With all of that said, though, instinct is not purely subjective. Many of the things we know to be true instinctively are also things that we know everyone else knows instinctively as well, proving that such instincts are not subjective. And to whatever extent we glean truth from our emotions, intuitions, experience, etc., we still do so in conjunction with our rationality. It is not like our minds turn off when we discover something emotionally. When one first falls in love, he or she clearly feels it in a very strongly emotionally. When he or she clearly feels it very strongly emotionally. No one denies this, but the mind still recognizes the presence of this emotion and that it cannot be denied. This does not mean that it is always wise to succumb to our emotions, and we should, in many instances, certainly deny them in that sense. But if we try to rationally say that we do not even have the emotion, we are not being rational. Far from it, we are being most irrational. And faith is a course of journey, and one that often does feel more like a labyrinth than a straight shot. But neither of these things even remotely proves that we should lessen our commitment to objectivity. Faith must have a content, and to believe in that content on non-objective grounds is credulity and not faith. If anything, therefore, objectivity is all the more important when it comes to religious truth, as we are dealing with the arena of life where we find our true fulfillment, and a pseudo-faith can only lead to a pseudo and temporary fulfillment. This head-heart dichotomy that so many on both sides try to create is simply false and detrimental. We must always remember that our emotions, intuitions, and experiences often deceive us, and so we must test them rationally. However, we also must be very careful not to try to completely explain them away simply because they are not easily explained from a rational perspective. We must emphasize both the head and the heart equally. They work together and are intended to do so. To deny our emotions is to deny our humanity. To deny our minds is to remove the grounds for all argumentation and thus human progress. Let us never do either one. Finally, the biggest problem with purely emotive or subjective arguments is that anyone can claim that something is true simply because they emotionally know it to be true. For example, I'm currently reading a book on the present state of Mormon theology from a Mormon scholar. In it, he writes, quote, "There are those who love to spout facts, studies, and evidence that supposedly prove the Book of Mormon is or isn't true. However, trying to use scientific study to confirm or deny the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon is like using a heart rate monitor to measure if you're in love. It's the wrong tool for the job," unquote. So Mormons know Mormonism is true due to emotional reasons, while PC or progressive Christianity people feel very strongly that progressive Christianity is true for emotional reasons as well. If emotions are the determining factor, how am I to know who to listen to? The Mormon or the progressive Christianity advocate? And why are my emotions dismissed? I have a strong emotional attachment to conservative evangelicalism as well as to logic and objectivity. If this is where my emotions lead me, why am I so wrong and bigoted for choosing conservative evangelicalism? This is why a purely emotional argument or approach is simply futile. Again, I'm not dismissing emotions. I understand that the Mormon has a deep-seated emotional attachment to Mormonism, as does the progressive Christian individual to progressive Christianity. Those emotions cannot be dismissed or explained away. However, they do not determine truth. They can certainly be one factor in the whole panorama of evidence that is presented for any worldview, but alone they determine very, very little. And that concludes the section on subjectivity and objectivity. The next section on the way people try to get around reality or first principles is called systemization. And I will cover that next time. So let me see. The book is important because it talks about, just a second here. The book is important because it talks about influence that the left has and is attempting to have over another aspect, and perhaps the most important aspect of American culture, namely the church. Chapter 4 is important because it demonstrates the foundations of not only Christianity and all intellectual endeavors, and not only Christianity, but all intellectual endeavors, and shows you how the left attempts to subvert those foundations. The subjectivity and objectivity section of Chapter 4 is important because it accurately describes the efforts of the left to subvert Christianity. Back in a minute. Thank you. In conclusion, I've read the introduction from the book Impeachment, a Handbook, New Edition by Charles L. Black, Jr., and read the section Subjectivity and Objectivity from Chapter 4 of A False Kind of Christianity, a conservative evangelical refutation of progressive Christianity by Dan Jensen. Who is the true conservative? He is the person that understands that conservatism is not just about politics, but culture as well. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He's consistent, credible, and influential. Not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He's a normal American, and he is better than the socialist. He's a better politician, friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. And that brings me to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. Remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win. True conservatives will never join their movement, and we won't shut up. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.